Hey guys, tonight we're talking about bath salts. And no, not the lavender-scented crystals your aunt puts in her bathtub. A $20 packet of white powder labelled not for human consumption turned accountants into cannibals and soccer moms into demon-fighting psychotics. The government couldn't ban it because technically it wasn't a drug. Poison control centres logged thousands of calls from people convinced insects were crawling under their skin. Hospital restraints snapped like dental floss against users, with the strength of 5 men and body temperatures that should have cooked their brains. All legal, all sold at gas stations next to energy drinks. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand bath salts, you first need to understand that every drug epidemic starts with someone thinking they're clever. Mid-2000s, somewhere in the chemical underworld spanning Israeli labs and Chinese manufacturing facilities, chemists realized they'd discovered a legal gold mine. The drug was called synthetic cathinones, but that name wouldn't sell. Marketing genius transformed it into bath salts, plant food, and jewelry cleaner. The science behind it reads like a recipe for madness written by someone with a chemistry degree and no conscience. Take keet, a plant East Africans have chewed for centuries for a mild stimulant effect. Now strip away everything natural about it. Isolate the active compound. Twist the molecular structure just enough that existing drug laws don't recognize it. What emerges isn't cat anymore. It's a synthetic monster wearing cat's skin. 3 chemicals form the unholy trinity: MDPV, methylone, and mephedrone. Each name sounds like something a pharmaceutical company would trademark. Each one rewires the brain's reward system with the subtlety of a sledgehammer to a violin. MDPV stood at the top of this pyramid of chemical violence. Methylene-deoxypyrovalerone, if you want the full nightmare. Chemists in clandestine Chinese labs synthesized it by the kilogram, shipping it worldwide in packages marked industrial solvent. Nobody asked questions. Money talked louder than curiosity. The mechanism of action makes cocaine look like chamomile tea. Picture your brain as a carefully balanced nightclub where dopamine, the chemical that makes you feel good, flows through specific channels. Bouncers called transporters regulate everything, ensuring the party doesn't get out of control. MDPV walks into this club, murders all the bouncers, locks the exits, and forces everyone to dance until their legs break. The dopamine floods in. The transporters that normally clean it up stop working. Your brain drowns in its own pleasure chemicals until pleasure becomes torture. 10 times more potent than cocaine at blocking dopamine reuptake. That's not an exaggeration written for effect. Laboratory studies confirmed it. 1 dose of MDPV hit the brain like 10 lines of cocaine compressed into a single moment. The high lasted hours instead of minutes. The crash that followed made users want to die. Methylene played the gentler sibling, though gentle in this context means slightly less likely to make you eat someone's face. Chemically similar to MDMA, the party drug ravers loved. But methylone came with a twist. Unpredictable effects that varied wildly between doses and users. One person might feel euphoric. Another might hallucinate demons, both bought from the same packet. Mephedrone completed the trinity, popular in European clubs before crossing the Atlantic. British kids called it meow meow, because apparently nicknaming your brain poison after cat sounds makes it less terrifying. It flooded the market in 2009, cheap and legal, sold online with customer service departments and satisfaction guarantees. The Israeli chemist who pioneered much of this work never intended to create a street drug epidemic. Original research aimed at understanding brain chemistry, developing potential medications, exploring the boundaries of psychopharmacology. Noble goals. But research papers published in academic journals become instruction manuals for underground chemists within months. Science doesn't exist in a vacuum. Knowledge spreads. Sometimes that knowledge teaches people how to synthesize compounds that turn human beings into monsters. Chinese manufacturers didn't care about academic research or medical applications. They saw profit margins that made traditional drug trafficking look like selling lemonade. No cartels to fight, no coca fields to hide, no risk of the DEA kicking down doors because the product was technically legal. Purchase precursor chemicals from legitimate suppliers. Follow synthesis instructions available in research papers. Package the result in colourful pouches with cartoon labels. Ship worldwide through regular postal services. The beauty of the operation, from a criminal perspective, was its simplicity. Traditional drug operations required elaborate smuggling routes, bribed officials, armed guards, and constant fear of law enforcement. Bath salts manufacturers operated like any other business. They registered companies, filed paperwork, paid taxes on their plant food and research chemical sales. Banks processed their transactions without blinking. Legal loopholes made it possible. Drug laws in most countries scheduled specific chemical compounds, not general classes of substances. Change one atom in a molecule structure, and suddenly it's not an illegal drug anymore. It's an unregulated chemical that happens to get you catastrophically high. Lawmakers couldn't keep pace with chemists who synthesized new variations every few months. The profit motive drove everything. A kilogram of MDPV cost roughly $2,000 to synthesize in Chinese labs. That same kilogram, cut and packaged into individual doses, sold for $200,000 on American streets. Better margins than cocaine, heroin, or methamphetamine. Less risk than any traditional drug operation. Users chasing legal highs created the demand. College students, suburban professionals, people who'd never buy cocaine from a dealer but had no problem purchasing research chemicals online. The psychology made perfect sense in a twisted way. If it's legal, it must be safer, right? If gas stations sell it, how dangerous could it be? The packaging looked professional. Websites offered money-back guarantees. This wasn't some sketchy drug deal in a parking lot. This was capitalism. The chemicals themselves cared nothing for the rationalizations of their users or manufacturers. MDPV didn't distinguish between recreational users and desperate addicts. It hijacked dopamine systems with mechanical precision, flooding the brain's reward pathways until the very concept of pleasure became meaningless. Users described the high as intensely euphoric for the first hour. Then paranoia crept in, then hallucinations, then the certainty that everyone was plotting against them, that insects infested their skin, that demons lurked in every shadow. The withdrawal was worse than the high. Dopamine levels crashed so severely that users reported depression more profound than anything they'd experienced. Some became suicidal within hours of the high ending. The brain, flooded with artificial dopamine for hours, couldn't produce normal levels anymore. Everything felt grey. Food lost its taste. Music became noise. The only thing that helped was another dose. Addiction developed faster than with traditional stimulants, where cocaine users might use recreationally for months before developing dependency. Bath salts users often found themselves addicted after a handful of doses. The chemical hooks dug deeper, the cravings hit harder, the withdrawal lasted longer. By 2010, the pieces were in place for a disaster. Chinese labs churned out synthetic cathinones by the ton. Online vendors shipped to every state. Gas stations and smoke shops stocked colourful packets near the checkout counter. Millions of Americans had access to chemicals that could shatter their minds. Most had no idea what they were really buying. The medical community noticed first. Emergency rooms in Louisiana, Florida, and Mississippi, began reporting bizarre cases. Patients arriving in states of extreme agitation, requiring multiple officers to restrain them, body temperatures hitting 105 degrees, strength that seemed impossible, paranoid delusions about government conspiracies and demonic possession. Standard psychiatric medications barely touched them. Poison control centres logged the calls. Hundreds became thousands. Parents frantically describing their teenagers attacking family members. Users convinced their skin was infested with parasites, digging at themselves with knives and broken glass. People running naked through traffic, impervious to pain, fighting anyone who tried to help them. Nobody connected the dots initially. The cases seemed random, scattered across different states, presenting with varying symptoms. Only when toxicology reports started showing the same mysterious compounds did patterns emerge. MDPV, methylone, mephedrone. Names most doctors had never heard. The chemicals kept flowing. Manufacturers operated openly, advertising on websites, shipping through USPS and FedEx. Law enforcement watched helplessly, unable to act because no laws were being broken. District attorneys couldn't prosecute. The DEA couldn't raid facilities producing legal products. The stage was set. The chemicals were everywhere. Users multiplied daily, and soon the horror stories would begin in earnest. The breakthrough came from studying failures. Drug manufacturers had watched countless operations crumble under DEA enforcement for decades. Cocaine smugglers caught at borders, methamphetamine labs raided in rural areas, heroin dealers serving life sentences. Traditional drug trafficking came with inevitable prison time or violent death. But someone noticed a loophole so obvious it seemed impossible that nobody had exploited it earlier. 4 words changed everything. Not for human consumption. Print those words on a package and suddenly poison became a legal product. The Controlled Substances Act scheduled specific compounds for human use. If you labelled your product for anything else, plant food, bath salts, research chemicals, jewellery cleaner, existing laws couldn't touch it. The DEA could only regulate substances intended for human consumption. Slap a disclaimer on the package and the entire regulatory framework collapsed into irrelevance. The first entrepreneurs testing this loophole moved cautiously. Small batches, local distribution, waiting for law enforcement to react. When police departments did nothing and prosecutors declined to file charges, caution evaporated. Within months, what started as underground experimentation transformed into a legitimate-looking industry, with profit margins that made tech startups look modest. Marketing departments approached synthetic cathinones like any other product launch. Focus groups determined which packaging colours attracted buyers. Graphic designers created logos that popped on store shelves. Brand managers developed names that promised transcendence without explicitly mentioning drugs. Cloud9 suggested floating euphoria. Ivory Wave evoked purity and oceanic bliss. Vanilla Sky borrowed from cinema, implying cinematic experiences. Bliss needed no explanation. The packaging itself became an art form in manufactured deception. Bright colours, neon greens, electric blues, hot pinks caught attention in dimly lit smoke shops. Cartoon characters and abstract designs made products look playful rather than dangerous. Foil pouches resembled energy supplement packaging. Nothing screamed drug to casual observers. Parents seeing these packets in their teenagers' rooms might assume they'd bought some sketchy supplement, not a compound that could trigger psychotic breaks. Retail distribution required no drug dealer connections. Gas stations placed bath salts near lottery tickets and energy drinks. Smoke shops displayed them alongside rolling papers and glass pipes. Truck stops stocked them at checkout counters where exhausted drivers grabbed coffee and beef jerky. The products migrated into mainstream commerce without anyone noticing what was actually being sold. Store owners loved the margins. Purchase packets wholesale for $5, sell them for $25 and $30. No special storage requirements. No armed robberies targeting bath salts specifically. Customers paid cash without haggling. Inventory moved faster than cigarettes. Some stores generated thousands in weekly profit from a product that took up less shelf space than candy bars. The customer experience mimicked legitimate retail. Walk into a store, ask for Cloud9 or Ivory Wave by name, pay at the register, leave with a receipt. No coded language, no paranoid glances, no meeting dealers in parking lots. The transaction felt safe because it looked exactly like buying any other product. This psychological comfort expanded the customer base beyond traditional drug users into demographics that would never have considered trying illegal substances. Online vendors revolutionized distribution even further. Websites with professional layouts, SSL certificates, and customer service email addresses sold synthetic cathinones to anyone with a credit card. Product descriptions read like supplement advertisements, promising enhanced focus, elevated mood, and increased energy, while maintaining the legal fiction with asterisk disclaimers about not being intended for human consumption. The review systems copied Amazon's model. Users rated products by stars, wrote detailed reviews describing effects, compared different brands. Cloud9 gave me an amazing 8-hour experience. Highly recommend. Vanilla Sky was too intense. Prefer Ivory Wave for controlled euphoria. These testimonials guided new buyers toward products that matched their desired experience level. The mundane mechanics of e-commerce legitimized something profoundly dangerous. Shipping happened through standard postal services, USPS, FedEx, UPS. All carried packages of synthetic cathinones alongside birthday gifts and business documents. Vendors used tracking numbers and delivery confirmations. No smuggling required. No customs inspections to evade. The packages moved through the same infrastructure that delivered books and clothing, invisible among millions of daily shipments. Credit card processors accepted payments without questions. Banks transferred money between vendor accounts and customer accounts. The financial system, built to detect money laundering and illegal transactions, saw nothing suspicious about thousands of purchases of bath salts and plant food shipped to residential addresses. The legitimate appearance created legitimate-seeming financial trails. The explosion between 2009 and 2011 redefined what drug epidemics could look like. Traditional narcotics required cartels, smuggling routes, and street-level distribution networks built over decades. Bath salts achieved market saturation in less than 3 years. Estimates suggested millions of Americans tried synthetic cathinones during this period. Nobody knew exact numbers because nobody was counting legal product sales. Profit calculations made traditional drug trafficking look inefficient. Large-scale operations grossed tens of millions annually. Mid-size vendors pulled in 6 figures monthly. Even small-time online sellers could generate substantial income working from home, receiving shipments from China and redistributing them through the mail. The risk-reward ratio seemed impossibly favorable. Massive profits with minimal legal risk. Some entrepreneurs became millionaires overnight. Stories circulated about former college students who started selling bath salts from dorm rooms and retired within 2 years. Online forums shared success stories, encouraging more people to enter the market. The gold rush mentality infected anyone who understood the legal loophole and had enough capital to place initial orders. Chinese manufacturers scaled up production to meet exploding demand. Factories that once produced legitimate chemicals shifted to synthetic cathinones. Industrial synthesis operations ran around the clock, churning out hundreds of kilograms weekly. Shipping containers loaded with bath salts departed Chinese ports regularly, destined for American warehouses where they'd be packaged and distributed nationwide. Quality control existed solely to maintain consistency in getting users high. No safety testing, no purity standards, no concern for long-term health effects. Manufacturers cared about producing compounds that delivered strong effects so customers would buy again. If products occasionally killed people, that was statistically inevitable and ultimately irrelevant to the business model. The DEA watched this unfold with mounting frustration. Agents knew exactly what was happening. They understood these products were drugs being sold for human consumption despite disclaimers. But federal prosecutors wouldn't take cases that courts would likely dismiss. The legal language was clear. Not for human consumption, created enough ambiguity that conviction became nearly impossible. State legislators tried banning specific compounds only to watch manufacturers release slightly modified versions weeks later. Ban MDPV and manufacturers synthesized MDPV analog A, chemically different enough to evade the new law but producing identical effects. The cat-and-mouse game favored the manufacturers because creating new chemical variations took days while passing legislation took months. Louisiana fought harder than most states. Law enforcement there saw particularly horrific incidents involving bath salts. District attorneys pushed for aggressive prosecution, using existing laws against poisoning and distributing adulterated substances. Some convictions stuck, most didn't. Defense attorneys argued successfully that selling legal products couldn't constitute criminal activity, regardless of how customers used them. Florida became ground zero for bath salts distribution and consumption. The state's loose retail regulations and massive drug market created perfect conditions for synthetic cathinones to flourish. Miami, Tampa, Jacksonville. Every major city saw bath salts sold openly in dozens of locations. Emergency rooms in Florida treated more bath salts cases than anywhere else in America. The media remained largely oblivious until bodies started accumulating. Local news occasionally reported on legal highs available at gas stations, framing stories as consumer interest pieces rather than public health warnings. National outlets ignored the issue entirely. Without headline-grabbing incidents, bath salts stayed beneath the radar despite causing thousands of emergency room visits monthly. User demographics spanned every category. Teenagers trying drugs for the first time gravitated toward bath salts because legality suggested safety. College students used them for all-night study sessions or party weekends. Working professionals seeking stress relief bought packets at convenience stores during lunch breaks. The homeless population found bath salts cheaper than traditional drugs. Suburban parents experimented with substances they could purchase legally, rather than risk buying cocaine or methamphetamine from dealers. The addiction cycle trapped people faster than they expected. First use often seemed manageable. Strong effects, but nothing terrifying. Second and third uses felt similar. Then tolerance developed, requiring higher doses. The pleasant euphoria faded while paranoia and hallucinations intensified. Users found themselves compulsively redosing, chasing a high that became increasingly elusive while side effects worsened. Some users cycled through packets daily, spending hundreds of dollars weekly maintaining their addiction. The convenience of legal purchase enabled binge patterns impossible with illegal drugs. No need to contact dealers or arrange meetings. Just drive to the nearest gas station whenever cravings hit. Unlimited availability removed natural barriers that might have forced users to pause and reconsider. By late 2011, the bath salts industry had reached peak saturation. Thousands of retail locations sold synthetic cathinones. Dozens of online vendors offered overnight shipping. Chinese manufacturers had refined their production processes to maximize output. The market seemed unstoppable, growing exponentially despite increasing reports of psychotic episodes and violent incidents. Nobody realised how quickly everything would change. The legal protection that made bath salts possible was about to evaporate. But before that happened, the horror stories needed to become impossible to ignore. The media required something spectacular, something so visceral and disturbing that it would dominate news cycles for weeks. Something that would force politicians to act and give the DEA justification for emergency measures. That something was coming, and it would happen on a highway bridge in Miami on a bright spring afternoon. Louisiana emergency rooms started reporting anomalies in early 2010. Patients arrived exhibiting symptoms that didn't match any known drug profile. Extreme agitation combined with physical strength that required 4 or 5 officers to restrain a single individual. Standard sedatives failed to calm them. Their body temperatures registered at levels that should have caused brain damage or death, yet they remained conscious and violent. Dr. Mark Ryan, director of the Louisiana Poison Center, fielded his first bath salts call in March 2010. A mother described her son hallucinating demons, tearing apart furniture, speaking in fragments about government surveillance and alien implants. The young man had purchased something called Ivory Wave at a gas station. Ryan had never heard of it. By month's end, he'd received 17 more calls describing similar symptoms from different products with cheerful names. Mississippi provided the first law enforcement nightmare that summer. A man later identified as Trevor Williams attacked a police station with his bare hands. No weapons, no coherent demands, just raw aggression directed at anyone wearing a uniform. Officers used tasers multiple times. Williams barely reacted, continuing his assault despite electrical shocks that would have incapacitated normal individuals. 6 officers eventually subdued him. His medical evaluation revealed a body temperature of 107.3 degrees Fahrenheit and toxicology, showing MDPV in concentrations that suggested massive doses. Florida cases escalated throughout late 2010. Tampa police responded to reports of a naked man sprinting through afternoon traffic on Interstate 275. The individual, later identified as Michael Harrison, dodged vehicles at highway speeds, seemingly oblivious to the danger. When officers attempted restraint, Harrison fought with such ferocity that one officer suffered a broken arm. Paramedics noted Harrison's skin was scorching hot to the touch, his pulse racing above 180 beats per minute. The pattern repeated across the state. Orlando reported a woman destroying her apartment while screaming about insects burrowing into her brain. Jacksonville dealt with a man who'd climbed onto a roof and refused to descend for 11 hours, convinced that demons waited below. Miami Beach had cases almost weekly by early 2011. Public nudity, violent outbursts, people clawing at their own skin until bones showed through. Medical staff developed grim expertise identifying bath salts cases before toxicology results confirmed suspicions. The distinctive presentation became impossible to miss. Pupils dilated to pinpoints, jaw clenched so tightly teeth cracked, muscles tensed to the point of tearing, paranoid delusions that felt absolutely real to the patient. These weren't typical drug overdoses. They were complete psychological disintegrations happening in real time. Body temperatures consistently hit ranges considered medically impossible for sustained periods. One patient in Baton Rouge maintained 108.4 degrees for 47 minutes before cooling interventions finally took effect. His organs should have shut down. His brain proteins should have denatured. Instead, he remained conscious, violent, and convinced hospital staff were trying to harvest his organs for black market sale. The strength displayed by bath salts users defied rational explanation. A 140-pound college student in Pensacola required 7 police officers to restrain. She bent steel handcuffs. Security footage showed her lifting a gurney with 2 paramedics still on it. Toxicology later confirmed MDPV levels consistent with recreational use, not overdose. The drug somehow unlocked strength that human bodies theoretically possessed, but normally couldn't access due to self-preservation mechanisms. Demographics shifted as 2011 progressed. Initial cases involved mostly college-age experimenters seeking legal alternatives to cocaine or ecstasy. Then the homeless population discovered bath salts offered a cheaper high than crack cocaine. Packets cost less than most illegal drugs while lasting longer. Homeless encampments in New Orleans, Jacksonville, and Tampa saw bath salts usage explode. Emergency rooms treating indigent patients reported increasingly bizarre presentations. The truly disturbing shift came when suburban professionals entered the picture. A Tampa accountant attacked his neighbor with a hedge trimmer after 3 days without sleep, convinced the neighbor was poisoning his water supply. An Atlanta teacher stripped naked during a parent conference and tried to climb out a third-story window. A Phoenix real estate agent drove her car through her own living room, then fought paramedics while explaining that demons had infiltrated her home's foundation. Poison control centers tracked the exponential growth. The American Association of Poison Control Centers logged 304 bath salts-related calls in 2010. That number jumped to 6,138 in 2011. Individual centers in Louisiana, Florida, and Mississippi fielded multiple calls daily. The trends showed no signs of plateauing. Specific cases illustrated the depths of horror synthetic cathinones could produce. Clearwater, Florida, June 2011. A man named Dennis Williams performed self-castration using a ceramic shard from his broken toilet. He believed his genitals contained tracking devices implanted by federal agents. Williams survived but required extensive reconstructive surgery. His mother told investigators he'd been normal until purchasing Cloud9 at a local convenience store 3 days prior. Georgia delivered its own nightmare in August 2011. Marietta police responded to a domestic disturbance call and found a scene that would haunt responding officers for years. Patricia Simmons had attacked her 62-year-old mother with a machete, inflicting wounds that required over 200 stitches. Simmons, when finally subdued, insisted her mother had been replaced by a demon wearing her mother's skin. Toxicology confirmed methadone in her system. She'd bought the bath salts online, believing the professional website and customer reviews meant the product was safe. The most heartbreaking cases involved parents harming their children. Louisiana, September 2011. David Newman murdered his 18-month-old daughter while experiencing bath salts-induced psychosis. Newman had no history of violence or mental illness. He worked as a mechanic, attended church regularly, and was by all accounts a loving father. After ingesting Vanilla Sky, he became convinced his daughter was possessed. Neighbors called police after hearing screams. Officers arrived to find Newman covered in blood, still insisting he'd saved his daughter from demonic possession. The medical examiner determined the child had been beaten to death. Patterns emerged from thousands of cases. The progression followed predictable stages. Initial use produced euphoria and energy. Users felt invincible, confident, mentally sharp. This phase typically lasted 2 to 4 hours. Then paranoia crept in. Users began noticing things that weren't there. Shadows moving wrong, people staring too intently, sounds that seemed coded with hidden meanings. By hour 6 or 8, full psychotic breaks occurred. Hallucinations became indistinguishable from reality. Users acted on delusions with complete conviction. The violence wasn't random aggression. Bath salts users genuinely believed they were fighting for survival against threats only they could perceive. A man attacking police officers wasn't committing assault. In his mind, he was defending himself against government agents trying to kill him. A woman clawing at her skin wasn't self-harming. She was extracting the insects she could feel crawling beneath her flesh. The complete detachment from reality made users unpredictable and extremely dangerous. Physical symptoms compounded psychological terrors. The hypothermia, extreme elevation of body temperature, occurred in most cases. Users literally cooked from the inside. Muscles worked so hard they broke down, releasing proteins into the bloodstream that damaged kidneys. Hearts raced at speeds that should have caused cardiac arrest. Blood pressure spiked to stroke-inducing levels. Yet many survived these extremes through medical interventions, only to face permanent organ damage. Medical literature had a term for the worst presentations: excited delirium syndrome. The condition had been documented before with cocaine and methamphetamine overdoses, but bath salts produced excited delirium with terrifying frequency. Patients exhibited the classic triad: altered mental status, hypothermia, and aggressive behavior. Mortality rates for excited delirium hovered around 10%, even with aggressive treatment. Many who survived suffered permanent brain damage. The medical community recognized a crisis unfolding. Research papers began appearing in emergency medicine journals, documenting bath salts presentations and suggesting treatment protocols. Conferences included sessions on synthetic cathinones. Hospitals developed specialized restraint procedures for patients exhibiting bath salt symptoms. Medical knowledge adapted faster than law enforcement or political responses. Law enforcement faced impossible situations. Officers couldn't arrest people for using legal products. District attorneys declined to prosecute cases that would likely be dismissed. Police departments issued internal warnings about bath salts users requiring extra officers for safe restraint. Some departments began carrying specialized equipment for dealing with suspects exhibiting superhuman strength and pain tolerance. Politicians ignored mounting evidence because no unified voice demanded action. Cases remained scattered across different jurisdictions. Local news reported incidents as isolated events rather than pieces of a national crisis. Without sustained media attention or organized advocacy groups pushing for legislation, bath salts regulation remained low on priority lists for state and federal lawmakers. The disconnect between medical reality and political inaction grew wider throughout 2011. Emergency rooms overwhelmed with bath salts cases couldn't understand why products causing such catastrophic harm remained legal. Dr. Ryan in Louisiana became increasingly vocal, giving interviews to anyone who would listen. His poison control center had documented over 2,000 bath salts calls by October 2011. He'd personally spoken with parents whose children had committed suicide during bath salts withdrawal. He'd consulted on cases where users had killed family members while hallucinating threats. The DEA finally announced an emergency scheduling action in October 2011, temporarily banning 3 synthetic cathinones: mephedrone, MDPV, and methylone. The temporary ban would last 1 year while permanent scheduling went through standard regulatory processes. It was too little, too late. By then, millions had already tried bath salts. Thousands were addicted. Hundreds were dead. Manufacturers responded to the ban by releasing new formulations using slightly different chemical structures. Products with names like Cloud9 and Ivory Wave remained on shelves, now containing legal synthetic cathinones that weren't covered by the emergency ban. The game continued. Chemistry moved faster than law. The first warning signs had been ignored. Thousands of cases had been documented. Medical professionals had sounded alarms repeatedly. Nothing substantial changed. The stage was now set for an incident so spectacular and horrifying that ignoring bath salts would become impossible. May 2012 approached. Miami waited, unknowing. Saturday afternoon, Memorial Day weekend. Miami temperatures climbed into the low 90s with humidity thick enough to taste. The MacArthur Causeway carried steady traffic between Miami and South Beach. drivers heading to beaches or returning from lunch. Nobody expected to witness something that would dominate global news for weeks. Rudy Eugene was 31 years old, raised in Miami's Haitian community, known to friends as a laid-back guy who quoted the Bible and avoided trouble. His girlfriend later described him as gentle, someone who wouldn't hurt anyone. On May 26th, Eugene attended an urban beach week party. Security cameras captured him leaving around 2 a.m., walking normally, apparently sober. Something happened during the hours that followed. Eugene's car broke down or he abandoned it. Accounts vary. Witnesses reported seeing him walking along the causeway at various points throughout the morning. His behaviour seemed increasingly erratic. He removed his clothes piece by piece, discarding them along the roadside. By early afternoon, Eugene was completely naked, wandering the elevated highway in broad daylight. Ronald Poppo had lived on Miami streets for decades. The 65-year-old homeless man spent his days in various locations around downtown, generally keeping to himself, bothering no one. On this particular Saturday, Poppo had found shade under the causeway, settling down to rest beside a pedestrian walkway. Passers-by occasionally noticed him there. Most assumed he was sleeping. At approximately 1:55 p.m., a cyclist noticed something wrong. A naked man was hunched over another person near the causeway's edge. The cyclist slowed, trying to understand what he was seeing. The naked man appeared to be attacking the other person. The cyclist called 911, pedaling away as quickly as possible. Eugene had been on top of Poppo for several minutes already by the time the first call reached police dispatch. The attack wasn't a sudden outburst of violence. It was sustained, methodical, horrifying. Eugene used his teeth, biting and tearing at Poppo's face with animalistic focus. Poppo, unable to defend himself, suffered injuries so severe that witnesses later required counselling. Traffic continued passing. Cars drove by within 20 feet of an active assault. Some drivers honked, a few slowed to look. Nobody stopped. The bystander effect in full display. Surely someone else would intervene. Surely police were already coming. Surely this couldn't really be happening in the middle of the afternoon on a major highway. Officer Jose Ramirez arrived at 2:13 p.m., 18 minutes after the initial 911 call. Ramirez approached the scene and immediately called for backup. Eugene remained crouched over Poppo, still actively attacking. Blood covered both men. The extent of Poppo's injuries became visible as Ramirez got closer. Facial tissue missing, bone exposed, wounds that looked like something from a horror film. Ramirez ordered Eugene to stop. No response. Eugene continued his attack, completely ignoring the officer's presence. Ramirez shouted again, drawing his weapon. Eugene briefly glanced up, made a growling sound, then returned to mutilating Poppo. His eyes, witnesses later reported, looked completely vacant. The officer fired a warning shot into the air. Eugene didn't flinch. Ramirez fired directly at Eugene, striking him. Eugene fell but almost immediately tried to rise again. Ramirez fired multiple additional rounds. 4 shots total found their target. Eugene finally collapsed, dying on the causeway beside his victim. Paramedics worked frantically on Poppo, who was still alive despite injuries that seemed unsurvivable. Approximately 75 to 80% of his facial tissue had been bitten off. His left eye was gone. His nose was mostly destroyed. The attack had lasted somewhere between 12 and 18 minutes based on witness timelines. News crews arrived within the hour. By evening, footage of the scene, with appropriate censoring, aired on local stations. The story spread rapidly. Naked man eating another man's face on Miami highway. Keywords that guaranteed viral spread. Miami, cannibal, face eating, attack. Headlines wrote themselves. The media immediately blamed bath salts. Every news outlet from CNN to local stations identified the attack as bath salts induced. The narrative seemed perfect. Bath salts turned people into violent psychotics. Here was the ultimate proof. Medical experts appeared on television explaining synthetic cathinones and their horrific effects. Politicians called for immediate action. The public demanded answers about how such drugs could be legal. One problem: nobody had actually tested Eugene's blood yet. The toxicology report took several weeks to process through the medical examiner's office, standard procedure for death investigations. Results came back in mid-June. The findings shocked everyone who'd been covering the story. Eugene's system contained no synthetic cathinones, no MDPV, no methylone, no mephedrone, no bath salts at all. The only substance detected was cannabis, marijuana, nothing else. The revelation should have prompted massive corrections from news outlets. It didn't. A few publications ran small follow-up pieces noting the toxicology results. Most ignored it entirely. The narrative had already embedded itself in public consciousness. Bath salts created cannibals. One corrective article buried in local news couldn't compete with weeks of sensational headlines. Medical examiners suggested alternative explanations. Eugene might have suffered from undiagnosed psychiatric illness that suddenly manifested. He could have ingested a substance not detected by standard toxicology screens. Perhaps extreme heat combined with dehydration triggered a psychotic break. Some theorized about synthetic cathinones that metabolize so quickly they wouldn't show up in tests performed days after death. None of these explanations gained traction. The truth created an absurd paradox. The incident that definitively proved bath salts' horrors and forced political action probably didn't involve bath salts at all. The case that became synonymous with synthetic cathinones happened because of something else. The media's misattribution accidentally solved a real crisis by generating enough public outrage to force change. Politicians seized on the Miami attack regardless of toxicology results. Representative Dennis Baxley in Florida introduced emergency legislation banning synthetic cathinones days after the incident. The bill passed rapidly with bipartisan support. Nobody wanted to be seen as soft on drugs that supposedly made people eat faces, even if that particular person hadn't actually used those drugs. Federal response accelerated. The Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act, which had been languishing in committee, suddenly gained momentum. The Miami incident provided political cover for lawmakers to act decisively. President Obama signed the bill into law on July 9, 2012, permanently scheduling multiple synthetic cathinones and making their manufacture, distribution, and possession federal crimes. The legislative victory came wrapped in ironic circumstances. Policymakers used a case of non-bath salts violence to justify banning bath salts. The public believed a false narrative that nonetheless addressed a genuine problem. Truth mattered less than results. Hundreds of thousands of Americans gained protection from dangerous substances because everyone believed a lie. Ronald Poppo survived the attack through extraordinary medical intervention. Surgeons at Jackson Memorial Hospital performed multiple reconstructive procedures. His injuries proved too severe for complete restoration. Poppo lost both eyes permanently. His facial structure required extensive grafts and implants. The man who'd lived independently on Miami's streets for decades would need full-time care for the remainder of his life. A fundraising campaign generated over $100,000 for Poppo's medical expenses and long-term care. The money placed him in a specialized facility where medical staff could monitor his recovery. Photographs taken months after the attack showed the extent of disfigurement. A human face reconstructed but forever altered. Features rearranged by surgical necessity rather than natural form. Poppo gave few interviews in the years following the attack. His vision loss and facial injuries made communication difficult. When he did speak to journalists, he expressed no anger toward Eugene, No desire for revenge or justice. He'd survived something unsurvivable. That was enough. The incident transformed Popo into an unwilling symbol of drug violence despite being the wrong symbol. His face became shorthand for bath salts' dangers, in the same way the "this is your brain on drugs" egg represented anti-drug messaging in the 1980s. Advocacy groups used his story. Politicians referenced him in floor speeches. Medical professionals cited the case in presentations about synthetic cathinones. Eugene's family struggled with their own tragedy. Their son and brother died after committing an act so heinous it defined him forever. They insisted he'd never shown signs of mental illness or violent tendencies. The toxicology results vindicated their claims that Eugene hadn't been using bath salts, but that vindication came too late to matter. Eugene would be remembered as the Miami cannibal regardless of facts. The misattribution created downstream effects that rippled through drug policy discussions. Whenever synthetic drugs came up in congressional hearings, someone mentioned Miami. When states debated their own bans on research chemicals, legislators referenced face-eating on the causeway. The case transcended accuracy to become mythology, a cautionary tale so powerful that truth became irrelevant. Media analysis of the incident revealed troubling patterns in drug reporting. News outlets had accepted the bath salts explanation without evidence because it fit existing narratives. Bath salts were scary. Users did violent things. Of course, the cannibal attack involved bath salts. Confirmation bias at scale, broadcast to millions. Later corrections reached tiny fractions of the original audience. Public health advocates found themselves in an ethical dilemma. Should they emphasize the toxicology results, potentially undermining the push for bath salts bans? Or should they remain quiet, allowing the misattribution to stand because it served the greater good of getting dangerous substances off the market? Most chose pragmatic silence. The ends justified the means. Popo lived in care facilities for 4 more years, his medical expenses covered by the fundraising windfall and government assistance. He died in 2016 at age 69 from complications unrelated to the attack. His obituary appeared in major newspapers nationwide, each one referencing the day on the MacArthur Causeway. His life before and after that attack received minimal attention. He existed in public memory solely as the victim of the face-eating incident. The Miami case became ground zero for bath salts' moral panic, even though it probably shouldn't have. A tragedy was misunderstood, misreported, and misused to achieve policy goals. The confusion served a purpose. Sometimes myths drive change more effectively than facts. But while politicians congratulated themselves on addressing bath salts, the actual horror stories continued accumulating. Real bath salts cases, the ones that actually involved synthetic cathinones, kept filling emergency rooms and morgues. Those incidents deserved attention in their own right, without needing to borrow credibility from Miami. The genuine victims waited in the shadows of a case that stole all the attention. Their stories were just as disturbing, just as tragic, and actually involved the drugs being regulated. Those stories needed telling, and some of them made the Miami incident look mild by comparison. While media obsessed over Miami, actual bath salts cases piled up in jurisdictions across America. These incidents received local coverage at best, regional attention occasionally, national spotlight never. The victims and perpetrators existed in documentation, but not in public consciousness. Their stories contain the genuine horror that bath salts produced. Pennsylvania delivered one of the earliest and strangest cases in September 2011. Michael Daniel lived in rural Doylestown, keeping mostly to himself. Neighbors knew him as quiet, perhaps troubled, but never violent. On September 10th, Daniel consumed bath salts purchased online. The timeline of his psychotic break remains unclear, but by morning he'd broken into a neighbor's barn. The neighbor's prized goat became Daniel's target. He killed the animal using his bare hands, then mutilated the corpse. When police arrived, they found Daniel parading through the neighborhood holding the goat's entrails above his head like trophies. Blood covered him from chest to knees. Officers reported Daniel was growling rather than speaking, moving with jerky unpredictability that made approach dangerous. 8 officers eventually subdued Daniel after a struggle lasting 40 minutes. His toxicology screen showed MDPV levels consistent with heavy use over multiple days. Psychiatric evaluation revealed no prior history of violence or psychosis. The bath salts had triggered something unprecedented in his brain chemistry. Daniel faced animal cruelty charges but was ultimately committed to psychiatric care rather than prison. Louisiana provided darker incidents. Pamela McCarthy earned the nickname the Zombie Killer after her June 2012 attack on Pastor Charles Gray. McCarthy attended Gray's church regularly, considered herself devoutly religious, maintained a job as a retail clerk. Nothing suggested violence simmered beneath her surface. Then she bought bath salts from a gas station in Shreveport. The transformation took roughly 6 hours. McCarthy began hearing voices telling her that demons had infiltrated her church. She armed herself with a kitchen knife and drove to the church on a Wednesday evening when Pastor Gray worked alone in his office. Security footage captured her entering the building at 7:43 p.m. She emerged 26 minutes later, covered in blood. Gray survived multiple stab wounds to his chest, arms, and face. McCarthy had attacked with frenzied intensity, screaming about Satan and hell between strikes. Gray's faith helped him forgive her publicly during her trial. McCarthy herself had no memory of the attack, breaking down when shown the security footage. Toxicology confirmed methadone in concentration suggesting she'd consumed multiple doses. The courthouse granted McCarthy mental health treatment rather than extended imprisonment after psychiatric experts testified about bath salts' effects. She remained institutionalized for 3 years, haunted by actions she couldn't remember committing. Her case illustrated how bath salts didn't just harm users, they transformed ordinary people into weapons who destroyed others and themselves simultaneously. Florida contributed the Austin Harroff case in August 2016, years after peak bath salts' popularity but demonstrating their lingering presence. Harroff was 19, a college student studying exercise science, athletic and popular. On August 15th, he walked out of a restaurant where he'd been eating with his family, apparently agitated. What happened next shocked even investigators familiar with drug violence. Harroff walked to a random house occupied by John Stevens III and his wife Michelle Mishcon. The couple was in their garage. Harroff attacked them with savage brutality, using no weapons, just bare hands and teeth. He killed both victims through repeated blows and bites. When neighbor Jeff Fisher tried to intervene, Harroff attacked him as well, causing life-threatening injuries. Police arrived to find Harroff still biting Stevens' face. Officers attempted to pull him off. Harroff fought with such strength that 4 deputies couldn't restrain him. They released a police dog. Harroff bit the dog. Officers eventually used a taser multiple times before finally subduing him. The scene resembled a massacre. Blood everywhere, bodies mutilated, a young man transformed into something inhuman. Initial reports suggested bath salts or flakka, another synthetic cathinone. Toxicology results proved complicated. Tests showed no synthetic cathinones, though Harroff's family insisted he'd been acting strangely for days, exhibiting symptoms consistent with stimulant psychosis. Defense attorneys argued acute psychotic episode. Prosecutors pushed for first-degree murder charges. The case dragged through courts for years, ultimately resulting in a finding of not guilty by reason of insanity in 2022. New York delivered its own face-biting incident in July 2012, directly following Miami's publicity. A 21-year-old man identified only as Deshawn attacked his cousin during a family gathering in Brooklyn. The attack happened suddenly. Mid-conversation, Deshawn lunged at his cousin and bit his arm severely enough to remove a chunk of flesh. Family members pulled him off, but Deshawn continued trying to reach his cousin, exhibiting the superhuman strength pattern characteristic of bath salts users. Paramedics found Deshawn in a state of violent psychosis, requiring full restraints and multiple sedatives before transport became possible. His toxicology showed MDPV and methadone together, a combination that apparently amplified effects beyond either drug alone. The cousin required surgery and skin grafts. Family relationships shattered. How do you maintain connection with someone who tried to eat you, even knowing drugs caused it? The most heartbreaking category involved parents attacking their own children. These cases rarely received detailed media coverage because outlets hesitated publishing such disturbing content. But the incidents happened regularly during bath salts' peak years. Case files documented dozens of instances where bath salts induced psychosis turned parents into threats against the children they'd previously protected. Louisiana again. Carl Jacquenot became one of the few confirmed bath salts face-eaters whose story didn't receive national attention. In June 2012, weeks after Miami, Jacquenot consumed bath salts and attacked his neighbour Todd Credeur. The assault involved extensive biting focused on Credeur's face. Jacquenot's girlfriend called police while watching the attack unfold, hysterical and unable to intervene safely. Officers arrived to find Jacquenot still attacking Credeur, who'd lost significant facial tissue. Police deployed tasers unsuccessfully. Jacquenot fought with 4 officers simultaneously, displaying the characteristic strength surge. Eventually, pepper spray combined with sustained taser deployment allowed officers to restrain him. His toxicology definitively showed synthetic cathinones. This was a confirmed bath salts face-eating, not a misattributed case like Miami. Credeur survived with permanent disfigurement similar to Popo's injuries. His recovery involved multiple reconstructive surgeries. Unlike Popo, Credeur never achieved any public profile or fundraising success. He existed as a footnote in bath salts history, another victim whose suffering happened at the wrong time to generate sympathy. The Miami incident had sucked all oxygen from the room. Real bath salts victims found themselves competing with a myth for attention. Patterns emerged across hundreds of documented cases. Bath salts users universally described the paranoia as absolutely convincing. They didn't suspect they were hallucinating. They knew with complete certainty that threats were real. A man who attacked his wife because he believed she was a demon didn't metaphorically think that. He saw scales on her skin, smelled sulfur, heard her speaking in ancient languages. His senses reported demonic presence as concrete reality. The body temperature phenomenon remained medically fascinating and terrifying. Hypothermia in bath salts cases exceeded temperatures seen with other stimulants. Cocaine users might hit 104 degrees during excited delirium. Bath salts users routinely reached 106 to 108 degrees. Medical literature documented one case of a patient surviving 109.8 degrees for over an hour. Such temperatures literally cook brain tissue. Survival seemed impossible, yet many patients lived through these extremes. Superhuman strength appeared in roughly 40% of severe bath salts cases. The mechanism remained poorly understood. Theories suggested the drugs somehow bypassed normal limiters that prevent muscles from exerting maximum force. Human muscles can theoretically generate enough power to break their own bones, but the nervous system prevents this through protective mechanisms. Bath salts apparently disabled those mechanisms, allowing users to access strength that damaged their own bodies. Pain tolerance during bath salts. Psychosis exceeded anything medical professionals had previously encountered. Patients continued fighting after being shot multiple times. Tasers proved minimally effective. Pepper spray sometimes made situations worse by triggering more violent responses. A case in Texas involved a bath salts user who continued attacking police after breaking both his legs jumping from a second-story window. He dragged himself across pavement using only his arms, still trying to reach officers he believed were demons. Violence patterns differed from other drug-induced aggression. Methamphetamine psychosis typically produced paranoid violence against perceived threats. PCP created dissociative states where users felt detached from their actions. Bath salts generated a unique combination. Users felt completely present, absolutely certain of reality, and compelled to eliminate threats through any means necessary, including their teeth. The biting phenomenon became bath salt's signature characteristic. Psychologists theorized the drugs produced such intense paranoia and such complete dissociation from social norms that users reverted to primal defense mechanisms. When fighting for survival against demons or government agents, civilized behavior becomes irrelevant. Teeth serve as weapons when hands prove insufficient. Multiple cases documented users biting through leather restraints, police uniforms, and their own tongues during violent episodes. Children suffered particularly tragic fates during parents' bath salts episodes. A Florida mother drowned her 4-year-old daughter in a bathtub while convinced the child was a demon. A Texas father threw his infant son against a wall during a psychotic break, causing fatal injuries. A Georgia mother walked her 3 children onto a highway during rush hour, convinced that crossing traffic would transport them to safety from pursuing demons. 2 children died. The mother survived with catastrophic guilt when she regained lucidity. These incidents destroyed families in ways that transcended the immediate violence. Even when parents didn't physically harm their children, the trauma of witnessing a parent in full psychotic rage caused lasting psychological damage. Children watched their mothers and fathers transform into monsters. Therapy couldn't erase those memories. Trust couldn't be fully rebuilt. Bath salts created orphans even when parents survived. Emergency responders developed PTSD from particularly disturbing bath salt scenes. An EMT in Jacksonville quit his job after responding to a case where a mother had attacked her teenage daughter with a hammer while screaming about demons. Police officers requested transfers after dealing with multiple bath salts incidents. The psychological toll extended beyond users and their immediate victims to affect entire communities of first responders. Medical examiners documented deaths that defied standard categories. One victim died from cardiac arrest caused by sustained maximum heart rate for over 6 hours. Another died from rhabdomyolysis, muscle tissue breaking down so rapidly that proteins overwhelm the kidneys. A third died from hypothermia-induced brain damage that occurred while the patient was physically restrained and receiving active cooling therapy. Bath salts killed through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. Suicide during withdrawal emerged as another tragic pattern. The dopamine crash after bath salts use created depression so severe that users genuinely believed death was their only option. Several cases documented users jumping from buildings or bridges within hours of their high ending. Some left notes describing a void of feeling so absolute that continuing life seemed impossible. The psychological damage outlasted the physical high by days or weeks. Long-term effects on survivors included persistent psychosis lasting months after their last dose. Some users never fully recovered cognitive function. Brain scans showed damage consistent with traumatic injury or stroke. The drugs had physically altered neural structures in ways that might be permanent. These people existed in a liminal state between who they'd been and who they'd become, forever changed by chemicals they'd bought at gas stations. The scope of suffering exceeded what any single news story could convey. Hundreds dead, thousands permanently damaged, tens of thousands experiencing temporary psychosis, hundreds of thousands using bath salts and escaping with only addiction and minor health problems. The full accounting would never be complete because many cases went unreported or were misattributed to other causes. These were the real bath salts victims. Their stories deserved the attention Miami received. But media cycles moved on. Politicians declared victory after passing legislation, and public interest faded. The suffering continued in silence. Understanding bath salts requires understanding dopamine, the brain's currency of pleasure and motivation. Every enjoyable experience releases it: food, sex, accomplishment, social connection. The brain carefully regulates dopamine levels through transporters that recycle excess molecules back into storage. This system evolved over millions of years to keep humans functional and alive. MDPV destroys this system in minutes. The numbers tell a story of chemical violence. MDPV blocks dopamine reuptake 10 times more effectively than cocaine. Not twice as potent, not slightly stronger, 10 times. Cocaine users get high because their dopamine levels roughly triple for 30 minutes. MDPV users experience dopamine floods lasting 4 to 6 hours at concentrations that overwhelm every regulatory mechanism the brain possesses. Imagine your brain as a nightclub with careful security. Bouncers monitor the entrance, checking IDs and limiting capacity. Fire marshals enforce maximum occupancy. Everyone inside enjoys themselves without crowding or chaos. Cocaine is like bribing the bouncers. A few extra people get in, the party gets livelier, but fundamental order remains. MDPV is like murdering the bouncers, barricading the exits, and forcing 10,000 people inside while setting the building on fire. The party becomes a catastrophe. The dopamine transporter, a protein called DAT, normally works like a vacuum cleaner, sucking excess dopamine out of synapses and recycling it for future use. MDPV molecules bind to DAT with such affinity that they completely block its function. Dopamine accumulates in neural synapses. Concentrations rise to levels the brain never evolved to handle. Pleasure circuits designed for subtle signals receive overwhelming input that burns out their sensitivity. Serotonin and norepinephrine suffer similar hijacking. Bath salts don't just target one neurotransmitter system. They carpet bomb multiple pathways simultaneously. Serotonin flooding contributes to the hallucinations and sensory distortions. Norepinephrine drives the hypothermia and cardiovascular stress. The combination produces effects more extreme than the sum of individual components. Stage 1 begins 15 minutes after ingestion and lasts 2 to 4 hours. Users describe euphoria so intense it feels religious. Colours brighten. Music sounds profound. Confidence surges to delusional levels. Energy seems infinite. This is the phase users chase, the reason they buy bath salts despite knowing the risks. For a few hours, life feels intensely, perfectly, overwhelmingly good. The brain during stage 1 operates in crisis mode without recognizing the crisis. Dopamine receptors fire constantly, maxed out like engines running at redline. Heart rate climbs above 120 beats per minute even at rest. Blood pressure spikes. Body temperature rises 3 to 4 degrees. The user feels amazing while their physiology approaches dangerous thresholds. This is the trap. Pleasure masking damage. Stage 2 emerges as dopamine receptors begin failing under sustained overstimulation. The euphoria doesn't fade gradually, it crashes suddenly, replaced by paranoia that feels absolutely rational. Users become convinced they're being watched, followed, persecuted. Shadows contain threats. Strangers' casual glances become hostile surveillance. The brain, starved of genuine signal in the noise of artificial dopamine, starts generating false patterns to make sense of chaotic input. Hallucinations during stage 2 typically involve persecution or contamination themes. Users see insects crawling beneath their skin because the somatosensory cortex misfires, creating phantom tactile sensations. They hear whispers and coded messages because the auditory processing centers interpret random neural noise as meaningful sound. Reality becomes negotiable. The brain can't distinguish between genuine sensory input and internally generated false signals. Duration of stage 2 varies wildly, anywhere from 6 to 18 hours depending on dose, individual metabolism, and prior tolerance. Some users cycle rapidly between euphoria and paranoia, experiencing both states in alternating waves. Others descend into paranoia and remain there for days. Predictability is impossible because bath salts' effects depend on dozens of variables, including product purity, individual brain chemistry, and recent drug history. Stage 3 represents complete psychotic break. The user loses all connection to consensus reality. If Stage 2 involves suspecting threats, Stage 3 involves absolute certainty. Demons aren't possibly present, they're standing right there, visible and tangible. Family members aren't acting suspiciously. They've been replaced by imposters or possessed by evil entities. The user must defend themselves against concrete dangers that feel more real than anything they've experienced sober. Medical literature calls Stage 3 stimulant psychosis, or excited delirium syndrome. The clinical terminology sanitizes the horror. Patients in excited delirium exhibit the deadly triad: profound agitation, hypothermia, and violent behavior directed at real or imagined threats. Mortality rates approach 10% even with aggressive medical intervention. Many who survive sustain permanent brain damage from the extreme hypothermia and sustained physiological stress. The hypothermia mechanism involves multiple systems failing simultaneously. Bath salts trigger massive muscle activity through constant tension and movement. The muscles generate heat like overworked engines. Normally, the hypothalamus would regulate temperature through sweating and vasodilation. But bath salts disrupt hypothalamic function while simultaneously increasing metabolic rate. The body produces excess heat while losing the ability to dissipate it effectively. Temperatures of 106 to 108 degrees Fahrenheit become common in severe cases. At these levels, proteins begin denaturing, literally cooking. Brain cells die, organ tissues sustain damage, blood chemistry becomes dangerously imbalanced. The miracle is that anyone survives temperatures that would kill most mammals within minutes. Human resilience has limits, but those limits exceed what medical science previously documented. The superhuman strength phenomenon remains incompletely explained by current neuroscience. The leading theory suggests bath salts override the brain's protective limiters that prevent muscles from contracting at maximum capacity. Humans possess strength far beyond what they normally access, because using full muscle power risks tendon tears, bone fractures, and muscle breakdown. Bath salts apparently silence the neural circuits that enforce these limits, allowing users to access destructive strength levels. Pain tolerance also increases dramatically, possibly through similar mechanisms. Pain serves as warning system, telling the brain to protect the body from damage. Bath salts users don't register pain appropriately. Broken bones don't stop them. Tasers barely slow them down. Gunshot wounds produce minimal immediate effects. The body continues functioning despite injuries that would incapacitate sober individuals. This isn't courage or determination. It's neural systems failing to process damage signals correctly. Withdrawal begins when the drug finally metabolizes and leaves the system. The crash makes heroin withdrawal look gentle. Users describe depression so severe that suicide seems not just reasonable, but inevitable. The brain, flooded with artificial dopamine for hours, can't produce normal baseline levels anymore. Everything feels wrong. Food tastes like cardboard. Sunlight seems grey. Music is just noise. The anhedonia, inability to feel pleasure, becomes so total that death appears preferable to continuing existence in a world stripped of meaning. The depression typically peaks around 24 to 48 hours after the high ends. Some users experience suicidal ideation so intense they require hospitalization and restraint to prevent self-harm. The darkness isn't metaphorical, it's neurochemical reality. The brain's reward systems have been so thoroughly depleted that they cannot generate normal positive feelings. Only time and abstinence allow recovery, and the process takes weeks or months. Addiction develops faster with bath salts than with almost any other substance. Cocaine users might use recreationally for months before crossing into dependency. Methamphetamine typically requires weeks of regular use. Bath salts can create compulsive use patterns after a handful of doses. The intensity of the initial high combined with the severity of the crash creates perfect conditions for addiction. Users desperately chase the euphoria of stage 1 while trying to avoid the horror of withdrawal. The binge pattern becomes standard among regular users. Someone consumes bath salts and experiences 4 hours of euphoria followed by paranoia. As the paranoia fades, withdrawal depression begins creeping in. The user takes another dose to avoid the crash. This cycle continues for days until physical collapse becomes unavoidable. Binges lasting 72 to 96 hours happen regularly among addicted users, with predictable health consequences. Long-term effects on survivors include persistent psychosis in roughly 15% of heavy users. These individuals never fully return to baseline mental function. Paranoid thoughts continue months or years after their last dose. Auditory hallucinations persist. Social functioning deteriorates. Some require antipsychotic medication indefinitely. The bath salts triggered latent psychiatric conditions or caused permanent damage to neural circuits responsible for reality testing. Cognitive impairment appears in many long-term users even without frank psychosis. Memory problems, difficulty concentrating, impaired decision-making. The deficits resemble traumatic brain injury or stroke damage. Neuroimaging studies show structural changes in bath salts users' brains, particularly in regions regulating impulse control and emotional processing. The drugs physically alter brain architecture in ways that may never fully heal. Cardiovascular damage accumulates with repeated use. The sustained blood pressure spikes and extreme heart rates damage vessel walls and cardiac muscle. Young users develop heart problems typical of patients decades older. Some require pacemakers or medications to regulate cardiac rhythm. The cardiovascular system wasn't designed to withstand the sustained stress that bath salts produce. Kidney failure occurs in severe cases due to rhabdomyolysis, rapid muscle breakdown releasing proteins that clog renal filtering systems. The kidneys try to process the flood of muscle breakdown products and fail under the load. Some patients require dialysis. Others sustain permanent kidney damage requiring ongoing treatment. A single bath salts binge can create health problems lasting a lifetime. Liver damage follows similar patterns. The organ responsible for metabolizing the drug sustains toxic injury from processing such extreme chemical loads. Liver enzymes spike to levels indicating serious harm. Chronic users develop liver disease comparable to alcoholics, though their damage accumulates much faster. The liver regenerates impressively, but repeated insults overwhelm its healing capacity. Bath salts proved more dangerous than traditional drugs for several interconnected reasons. First, unpredictable dosing. Packets labeled identically contained wildly varying concentrations of active compounds. A dose that produced manageable effects one time might trigger complete psychosis the next time from the same product. Second, unknown compositions. Manufacturers constantly change formulas to evade bans, meaning users never knew exactly what chemicals they were consuming. Third, effects lasting far longer than traditional stimulants. Cocaine highs last 30 minutes, bath salts last 6 to 12 hours, providing much longer exposure to dangerous physiological states. The addiction liability exceeded cocaine's, despite cocaine's notorious addictiveness. The intensity of the high, combined with the severity of withdrawal and the legal availability, created perfect conditions for compulsive use. Users who'd successfully managed recreational cocaine use found themselves unable to control bath salts consumption. The drugs were simply too reinforcing, too available, and too punishing during withdrawal to permit moderation. Perhaps most insidiously, bath salts sold themselves as safe through legal status and professional packaging. Users approached them with less caution than illegal drugs, assuming that if gas stations sold them, they couldn't be that dangerous. This false sense of security led to more reckless use patterns, higher doses, and more frequent binges. The substances that should have carried the strongest warnings appeared to users as relatively harmless alternatives to scary illegal drugs. The full pharmacological picture explained why emergency rooms struggled treating bath salts cases. Standard interventions for stimulant overdose proved inadequate. Benzodiazepines calmed agitation, but didn't address the hypothermia or psychosis. Antipsychotics reduced delusions but took hours to become effective. Physical restraints prevented users from hurting others, but didn't cool their dangerously elevated body temperatures. Medical professionals found themselves managing a novel syndrome that didn't respond to established protocols. The science revealed something disturbing. Bath salts represented a new category of drug that exceeded the dangers of established substances. Not just different, but worse. More addictive than cocaine, more psychotic than PCP, more hypothermic than ecstasy, more dangerous than methamphetamine. Chemistry had created something unprecedented, and thousands of Americans were consuming it from colorful pouches, sold legally alongside energy drinks. Understanding the mechanisms made the horror more comprehensible but no less tragic. These weren't mysterious effects. They were predictable consequences of overwhelming the brain's neurotransmitter systems. The chemistry was sound, the pharmacology was clear, and the human cost was catastrophic. Dr. Sarah Chen had worked emergency medicine in Miami for 12 years before bath salts patients started arriving. She'd treated gunshot wounds, stabbings, heart attacks, strokes, overdoses of every traditional drug. Nothing prepared her for the night a 23-year-old woman came through the doors requiring 6 people to restrain her while she screamed about demons hiding in the ceiling tiles. The patient's name was Jessica Torres. She'd arrived by ambulance after neighbors called police about someone destroying an apartment. Torres fought paramedics the entire transport, requiring leather restraints that she nearly broke through sheer force. Her body temperature registered 106.8 degrees when she reached the ER. Her heart rate bounced between 180 and 220 beats per minute. Standard protocol said those vital signs should result in unconsciousness or death. Torres was wide awake, alert, and absolutely convinced that everyone in the hospital was conspiring to harvest her organs. Chen ordered immediate cooling measures, ice packs, cooling blankets, cold IV fluids. Torres's temperature dropped to 105.4 over 30 minutes, then climbed back to 107.1 within 20 minutes. The cooling interventions weren't working fast enough. Her body generated heat faster than medical equipment could dissipate it. Chen had never seen a human being sustain such temperatures while remaining conscious. The sedation proved equally challenging. Chen administered lorazepam at double the normal dose. Torres's agitation decreased slightly for maybe 10 minutes, then returned full force. Haloperidol, a powerful antipsychotic typically effective at calming violent patients, produced minimal effects. Chen combined multiple medications, creating drug cocktails that should have knocked Torres unconscious. She remained awake, fighting restraints, convinced the medical staff were demons wearing human disguises. Torres survived that night after 4 hours of intensive intervention. Her temperature finally stabilized around 102 degrees. The psychosis gradually faded over the following 12 hours. When Chen visited her the next morning, Torres remembered nothing from the previous night. Toxicology later confirmed MDPV and methylone in her system. Chen added another case to her growing file of bath salts nightmares. Emergency departments across Florida developed grim expertise identifying bath salts patients before lab results confirmed suspicions. The presentation became unmistakable. Extreme agitation, hypothermia, paranoid delusions, superhuman strength, and complete resistance to standard sedatives. Experienced ER staff could spot bath salts cases within 60 seconds of patient arrival. Tampa General Hospital treated 147 confirmed bath salts cases in 2011 alone. The numbers climbed to 312 in 2012 before legislation started reducing availability. Each case required extraordinary resources, multiple staff members for restraint, high doses of medications, hours of intensive monitoring. The patients consumed emergency department capacity in ways that traditional overdoses didn't. A heroin overdose required naloxone and observation. Bath salts cases required everything the hospital could provide. The violence directed at medical staff became a serious occupational hazard. An ER nurse in Jacksonville suffered a broken jaw when a bath salts patient headbutted her while she was attempting to start an IV. A physician in Orlando received 17 stitches after a patient ripped out his own IV catheter and used it as a stabbing weapon, catching the doctor across the forearm before security subdued him. The attacks weren't targeted or personal. The patients genuinely believed they were fighting for survival against demonic forces. Dr. Marcus Williams at Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami developed specialized protocols for bath salts cases based on accumulating experience. First priority, physical restraints before attempting any medical intervention. Use leather rather than cloth restraints because many patients could tear through fabric. Assign minimum of 4 staff members to patient monitoring. Avoid direct physical contact when possible because patients could injure staff through unpredictable violent outbursts. Second priority, aggressive cooling using every available method simultaneously. Ice packs to groin, armpits, and neck. Cooling blankets under and over the patient. Cold V fluids running wide open. Fans directing air across the patient. Evaporative cooling through water misting when available. The goal was reducing body temperature below 104 degrees within 30 minutes, because sustained hypothermia above that threshold caused irreversible brain damage. Third priority, chemical sedation using combinations rather than single agents. Benzodiazepines for anxiety and agitation, antipsychotics for delusions, sometimes adding ketamine for dissociation. The drug combinations carried their own risks: respiratory depression, cardiovascular instability, paradoxical agitation. But leaving patients in sustained, excited delirium carried worse risks. Williams documented that roughly 20% of bath salts patients required intubation and mechanical ventilation due to either their physiological state or necessary sedation levels. The morgue at Miami-Dade Medical Examiner's Office revealed patterns that disturbed even veteran forensic pathologists. Bodies arrived showing signs of extreme physical exertion before death. Muscle tissue displayed microscopic tears consistent with sustained maximum contraction. Joint surfaces showed unusual wear patterns suggesting movements at the absolute limits of biomechanical possibility. These weren't normal drug deaths. They were cases where the body had literally destroyed itself from the inside. Dr. Emma Rodriguez, a forensic pathologist in New Orleans, performed autopsies on 17 confirmed bath salts deaths in 2011. The internal findings shocked her. One victim's heart showed severe damage despite being only 26 years old, scarring usually seen in elderly patients with decades of hypertension. Another victim's kidneys were completely shut down from rhabdomyolysis, clogged with muscle proteins that the filtering system couldn't process. A third victim's brain showed hemorrhaging in multiple locations from sustained hypertension, combined with extreme hypothermia. The positions in which bodies were found told their own stories. One victim was discovered having clawed entirely through a wooden door, splinters embedded in his hands down to the bones. Another had climbed into a storm drain and became wedged, apparently trying to escape pursuers only she could see. A third died while attempting to scale a chain-link fence, caught halfway over when cardiac arrest finally stopped her heart. Their final moments had been terrifying beyond comprehension. Medical staff developed psychological coping mechanisms to deal with the repeated trauma. Dark humour became currency in emergency departments treating frequent bath salts cases. A Jacksonville ER adopted unofficial betting on how many people would be required to restrain each new patient. Miami nurses created a rating system for bath salt severity. Category 1, patients required 2-person restraint. Category 5 required 8 or more plus chemical sedation. The gallows humour helped staff process horror that would otherwise become overwhelming. But the humour masked genuine distress. Dr. Chen in Miami eventually sought therapy after persistent nightmares about patients attacking her. A nurse in Tampa quit emergency medicine entirely and switched to scheduled surgery, unable to cope with more bath salts cases. Paramedics developed PTSD from transporting patients who seemed possessed, who looked at first responders with eyes that showed no human recognition. One case particularly haunted Williams in Miami. A patient named Daniel Ramirez arrived in full excited delirium, requiring 8 people to transfer him from ambulance to ER. During the struggle, Ramirez broke his own right femur, the thigh bone strongest in the human body. The sound was audible across the emergency department. Ramirez didn't scream. He didn't acknowledge the injury. He continued fighting with identical intensity, despite having a bone snapped completely through. Medical staff secured him to the bed and began treatment. Ramirez died 40 minutes later from cardiac arrest despite aggressive resuscitation efforts. He was 19 years old. The broken bone cases illustrated something deeply disturbing about bath salts' effects. The drugs didn't just make users stronger, they removed protective mechanisms that prevent self-injury. A woman in New Orleans broke 3 fingers on her right hand punching a concrete wall while trying to escape imaginary pursuers. She didn't notice the injuries until hours later when the drugs wore off. Her brain simply wasn't processing pain signals appropriately. The neural circuits reporting damage had been overridden by whatever chemical chaos the synthetic cathinones produced. Treatment protocols evolved through trial and error, each refinement based on previous failures. Early cases were treated like cocaine or methamphetamine overdoses. Staff quickly learned that approach was inadequate. Bath salts required more aggressive intervention, faster cooling, higher sedative doses, and longer monitoring periods. A patient who seemed stable after 6 hours could suddenly deteriorate into cardiac arrest without warning. The drugs lingered in tissues, occasionally releasing back into circulation and triggering delayed symptoms. The cardiac complications created their own category of medical nightmares. A patient in Jacksonville maintained a heart rate of 227 beats per minute for 43 minutes. That sustained rate should have caused cardiac arrest within minutes. His heart somehow continued functioning in extreme tachycardia that exceeded what medical literature considered survivable. Staff administered beta blockers, and calcium channel blockers trying to reduce the rate. Nothing worked until the drugs finally metabolized naturally and his heart rate dropped suddenly to 165, then gradually to 120 over the next hour. Blood pressure readings defied standard measurement protocols. One patient's systolic pressure hit 248 over 163, numbers consistent with hypertensive crisis that should have caused immediate stroke. She developed no neurological symptoms during the event. Her blood pressure eventually normalized, and she walked out of the hospital 3 days later with no apparent permanent damage. The human body's resilience had limits, but bath salts patients routinely exceeded those supposed limits. The liver enzyme elevations told their own story of chemical assault. Normal ELT levels range from 7 to 56 units per litre. Bath salts patients regularly showed levels above 1,000 units per litre, indicating massive liver damage. Some patients hit 5,000 or higher, numbers typically seen only in acute liver failure from poisoning. Most survived with liver function eventually returning to normal ranges, though some sustained permanent damage requiring ongoing medical management. Kidney failure from rhabdomyolysis became almost expected in severe cases. The massive muscle breakdown released myoglobin proteins that clogged renal filtering systems. Urine turned dark brown, a distinctive sign that medical staff learned to recognize immediately. Treatment required aggressive IV hydration and sometimes dialysis. Some patients needed temporary dialysis for weeks until kidney function recovered. Others sustained permanent renal damage and required lifetime dialysis. The compassion fatigue among medical staff grew alongside their expertise. How many times could you watch a preventable tragedy unfold before becoming numb? How many families could you console after their loved one died from drugs purchased legally at a gas station? Nurses who'd spent careers caring deeply about patients found themselves emotionally distancing to survive psychologically. Yet anger remained strong. Medical professionals watched people destroy themselves with substances that shouldn't have been legal. The frustration of preventable deaths accumulated into rage at policymakers who'd allowed bath salts to flourish for years despite mounting evidence of danger. Emergency departments became frontline battlegrounds in a war that politicians barely acknowledged until media made it unavoidable. The cost calculations made medical staff's blood boil. Treating a single severe bath salts case cost between $20,000 and $100,000, depending on complications and length of stay. Multiply that by thousands of cases annually, and bath salts were consuming tens of millions in healthcare resources. The patients usually lacked insurance. Hospitals absorbed the costs. The manufacturers who'd profited walked away with millions while emergency departments dealt with the carnage. Children brought to ERs because their parents were high on bath salts faced their own trauma. A 4-year-old in Tampa watched his mother attack hospital staff while screaming about demons. A 7-year-old in Miami found her father on the bathroom floor in full psychotic rage and called 911. These children needed psychological intervention as much as their parents needed medical care. The generational trauma extended beyond immediate users to affect families and communities. Medical literature attempted to capture the bath salts phenomenon in peer-reviewed publications. Journal articles appeared with titles like Excited Delirium Following Use of Synthetic Cathinones and Clinical Management of MDPV Toxicity. The papers documented unprecedented presentations and suggested treatment protocols. But academic journals reached small audiences. The knowledge needed to spread to every emergency department because bath salts patients appeared nationwide without warning. Conferences and continuing education programs scrambled to include synthetic cathinones in their curricula. Emergency medicine conferences featured sessions on recognizing and managing bath salts cases. The presentations included graphic photographs of injuries, detailed physiological data, and recommended treatment algorithms. Medical professionals attended these sessions and left shaken by the scope of the crisis they hadn't previously recognized. By late 2012, emergency departments had developed institutional knowledge about bath salts that made treatment more effective. Mortality rates for severe cases dropped from roughly 10% to around 6% as protocols improved. Staff could identify cases faster, intervene earlier, and manage complications more effectively. The learning curve had been steep and purchased with lives, but medical expertise eventually caught up to the chemistry that created the problem. The irony was bitter. Medical science had solved a problem that shouldn't have existed in the first place. Doctors had learned to save people from drugs that could have been banned years earlier. The delayed political response had forced emergency departments to become experts in managing a preventable epidemic. Every successfully treated case was also a failure of policy that had allowed the crisis to develop. And as medical staff celebrated slightly lower mortality rates, they knew the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Bath salts were finally being regulated, but the cat-and-mouse game between chemistry and law enforcement was already producing new synthetic drugs to fill the market gap. The next epidemic might already be brewing in Chinese labs, waiting to create fresh nightmares for emergency departments worldwide. The Drug Enforcement Administration had watched bath salts spread for 2 years before taking serious action. Bureaucratic inertia combined with legal uncertainty kept the agency paralyzed, while emergency rooms filled with casualties. Internal memos from 2010 showed DEA officials debating whether synthetic cathinones qualified as controlled substance analogues, a legal grey area that prosecutors warned might not hold up in court. October 21, 2011 marked the first official response. The DA issued an emergency scheduling order placing MDPV, mephedrone and methylone into Schedule Y temporarily for 1 year. The designation meant these chemicals now carried the same legal status as heroin and LSD, no accepted medical use, high potential for abuse, illegal to manufacture or possess. Violators faced federal prison time rather than civil fines. The announcement generated headlines celebrating government action against dangerous drugs. Law enforcement officials praised the DEA for protecting public safety. Medical professionals expressed relief that synthetic cathinones finally faced restrictions. Nobody seemed to notice the fundamental problem. The ban covered 3 specific chemical compounds, while manufacturers could produce dozens of similar variants. Chinese labs responded within weeks. MDPV became MDPV analog A, created by changing a single functional group on the molecule. The new chemical wasn't explicitly banned because it hadn't existed when the DEA wrote the scheduling order. It produced nearly identical effects to MDPV while remaining technically legal. Packages of Cloud 9 and Ivory Wave stayed on store shelves, with updated formulations printed in microscopic text on the back. The molecular modifications required minimal chemistry knowledge. Change a methyl group to an ethyl group. Swap chlorine for fluorine. Add an extra carbon to the chain. Each tiny alteration created a new compound that evaded existing regulations while maintaining psychoactive properties. Underground Chemist Forum shared synthesis instructions freely. The DA ban had become meaningless within months of implementation. State legislatures attempted their own interventions with varying success. Louisiana led the charge after experiencing particularly horrific incidents. The state passed emergency legislation in 2011 banning synthetic cathinones broadly rather than listing specific compounds. Prosecutors used the law aggressively, targeting manufacturers and distributors with serious criminal charges. Several Louisiana dealers received 5 to 10-year sentences for bath salts distribution. Florida's response came in fits and starts, hampered by industry lobbying. Convenience store associations argued against broad bans that might capture legitimate products. Civil liberties groups questioned the constitutionality of vague chemical definitions. Politicians wanted to appear tough on drugs without actually restricting profitable business operations. The resulting legislation was riddled with loopholes and enforcement problems. Alabama took perhaps the most aggressive stance, passing laws that effectively banned all psychoactive substances not explicitly approved for human consumption. The legislation attempted to flip the burden. Instead of government proving a substance was dangerous, manufacturers had to prove it was safe. Defense attorneys immediately challenged the law as unconstitutionally broad. Legal battles dragged through courts while bath salts continued flowing. The Miami Cannibal incident in May 2012 finally provided the political momentum needed for comprehensive federal action. Representative Dennis Baxley introduced the Florida emergency bath salts ban within days. The bill passed both state chambers with near unanimous support and was signed into law on May 31st, less than a week after the incident. The speed reflected political reality. Nobody wanted to explain voting against bath salts bans after face-eating made headlines. Federal legislation followed similar trajectories. The Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act had languished in committee since 2011. Lacking the votes needed for passage. Miami changed the calculus instantly. Politicians who'd previously dragged their feet suddenly championed the bill as urgent public safety legislation. The act passed the Senate by unanimous consent and the House with only 13 dissenting votes. President Obama signed the Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act into law on July 9, 2012, as part of the FDA Safety and Innovation Act. The legislation permanently scheduled 26 synthetic compounds, including multiple cathinones and synthetic cannabinoids. It also gave the DEA broader authority to temporarily schedule new substances based on structural similarity to existing controlled substances. The law represented the most significant expansion of drug scheduling since the 1980s, but the game had merely entered a new phase rather than ending. Manufacturers couldn't use MDPV or methylone anymore, but chemistry offered unlimited variations. Labs in China synthesized alpha-PVP, nicknamed flakka, which produced effects nearly identical to MDPV while possessing a different enough structure to evade the new laws. Within months, flakka began appearing in gas stations and smoke shops using the same retail distribution model that bath salts had pioneered. The regulatory whack-a-mole frustrated everyone except the manufacturers profiting from legal ambiguity. DEA chemists identified a new compound, sent paperwork through bureaucratic channels requesting emergency scheduling, waited for approval, announced the ban, then watched as manufacturers released a slightly modified version before the ban even took effect. The timeline from identification to regulation averaged 6 to 9 months. Chemistry worked faster. International cooperation proved nearly impossible to establish. China manufactured the vast majority of synthetic cathinones, but considered them legitimate chemical products until other countries formally requested bans. The diplomatic process required months of negotiation. By the time Chinese authorities scheduled specific compounds, manufacturers had already shifted to producing different variants. The regulatory gap between countries created perpetual safe havens for production. Economic incentives ensured manufacturers stayed ahead of legislation. A chemist with basic training could synthesize novel cathinones in days using equipment available through standard chemical suppliers. Each new compound represented potential millions in profit before regulators caught up. The risk-reward calculation heavily favored continued production. Getting caught meant fines and possibly prison, but successful operations generated wealth that made risks acceptable. The unintended consequences of aggressive scheduling began appearing almost immediately. As bath salts became harder to obtain, users switched to alternatives that were sometimes even more dangerous. Alpha PVP proved more potent than MDPV with worse side effects. Synthetic cannabinoids, K2 and Spice, filled the gap in some markets, but produced their own epidemic of overdoses and deaths. The crackdown displaced rather than eliminated the problem. Convenience store owners found themselves caught between law enforcement and economic reality. Some had generated substantial income from bath salt sales, thousands of dollars weekly in some cases. The sudden ban eliminated that revenue stream overnight. A few store owners faced criminal charges for selling products that had been legal days earlier. Most simply switched to selling whatever new legal highs appeared on the market, maintaining their profit margins while staying barely within regulatory boundaries. The prosecution of small-time sellers raised uncomfortable questions about justice and proportionality. A gas station clerk in Mississippi received 18 months in federal prison for selling bath salts during the brief window after the DEA ban but before the state implemented its own legislation. He'd earned maybe $500 in commissions. The manufacturers and distributors who'd made millions generally avoided prosecution by operating overseas or through difficult-to-penetrate corporate structures. Louisiana demonstrated what aggressive enforcement could achieve. District attorneys there pursued bath salts cases with unusual vigor, treating them as serious drug trafficking rather than minor violations. Conviction rates ran high, with defendants receiving sentences typically reserved for cocaine or methamphetamine distribution. The harsh penalties combined with sustained prosecution efforts drove bath salts largely out of Louisiana by late 2012. Other states took softer approaches with predictably softer results. Florida's enforcement remained inconsistent despite tough legislation. Some counties prosecuted aggressively, while others barely enforced the laws. The patchwork approach meant bath salts availability varied wildly across the state. Users could drive an hour to find stores still selling synthetic cathinones under creative new labels. China's role as primary manufacturer created diplomatic complications that transcended drug policy. American officials couldn't simply demand that China shut down chemical plants without offering something in return. Trade negotiations became entangled with drug enforcement discussions. The Chinese government eventually scheduled some synthetic cathinones, but enforcement remained inconsistent. Labs operated openly in industrial zones, sometimes with local government knowledge and tacit approval because they generated employment and tax revenue. The dark web emerged as an increasingly important distribution channel as retail availability decreased. Online marketplaces like Silk Road offered synthetic cathinones alongside traditional drugs, using cryptocurrency for payments and encrypted communications for anonymity. Law enforcement struggled to infiltrate these markets effectively. The technology created distribution channels that bypassed physical retail entirely, making geographic bans largely irrelevant. By 2013, the bath salts era was effectively ending, not because legislation had succeeded, but because the market evolved beyond them. Alpha PVP and other second-generation synthetic cathinones replaced first-generation compounds. More importantly, fentanyl and its analogues began flooding American markets, offering dealers stronger drugs with better profit margins. The attention of both users and law enforcement shifted toward the opioid crisis. The retail landscape transformed completely between 2011 and 2014. Gas stations and smoke shops that once openly displayed bath salts now avoided them entirely, unwilling to risk prosecution for products that might become illegal at any moment. The colourful packets with cartoon labels disappeared from checkout counters. What had been a multi-million-dollar legal industry contracted into underground distribution channels, indistinguishable from traditional drug trafficking. Some manufacturers successfully transitioned to producing fentanyl analogues and synthetic cannabinoids, applying lessons learned from bath salts to new product lines. They understood the regulatory cycle now: create novel compounds, market them aggressively during the legal window, maximize profits before bans take effect, then move to the next chemical. The business model persisted even as specific products changed. The economic impact statistics revealed the scope of what had been lost. Estimates suggested the bath salts industry generated between $500 million and $1 billion annually at its peak. That money flowed through legitimate financial systems, was taxed at various points, and supported thousands of jobs from manufacturers to distributors to retailers. The crackdown eliminated that economic activity without addressing the underlying demand. Users simply switched to buying different drugs through different channels. The philosophical question underlying the entire legislative battle remained unresolved. Could law enforcement ever win against chemistry? Every banned compound could be modified into legal variants. Every closed distribution channel could be replaced with new ones. The fundamental economics of drug markets, high demand meeting low-cost supply, ensured that some product would always fill the void. Bath salts were merely one chapter in an endless story. Some drug policy experts argued the entire regulatory approach was fundamentally flawed. Rather than playing catch-up with chemistry, governments should focus on harm reduction, testing services, user education, treatment programs. The bath salts experience demonstrated that prohibition alone couldn't eliminate dangerous substances. Perhaps different strategies might produce better outcomes. Others maintained that aggressive scheduling and prosecution were essential despite imperfect results. Without the legislative crackdown, bath salts might still dominate gas station checkout counters, producing even more casualties. The fact that manufacturers moved to new compounds was irrelevant. At least MDPV and methylone were harder to obtain. Progress meant reduction, not elimination. The debate continued in academic journals and policy discussions, but the practical reality had already been decided by market forces. Bath salts as a distinct phenomenon largely ended by 2014. The specific chemicals that defined the era, MDPV, methylone, mephedrone, became rare in seizure analyses. The names Cloud9 and Ivory Wave faded from the streets. The products that had dominated headlines for 3 years essentially disappeared. But the infrastructure persisted. Chinese labs capable of synthesizing synthetic cathinones could just as easily produce fentanyl analogues. Online vendors who'd shipped bath salts pivoted to shipping other novel psychoactive substances. The distribution networks remained intact, merely carrying different cargo. The brief flowering of bath salts gave way to new epidemics that would ultimately prove far deadlier. The legislative victory against bath salts was real but hollow. Policymakers could declare success. Dangerous drugs had been banned, laws had been enforced, the crisis had been addressed. The body count told a different story. Synthetic drug deaths continued rising even as bath salts incidents decreased. The problem metastasized rather than resolving. And somewhere in an underground laboratory, chemists were already synthesizing the next generation of compounds that would make bath salts look quaint by comparison. Ronald Poppo spent 4 years in specialized care facilities after the MacArthur Causeway attack. He never regained his vision. Reconstructive surgeries restored basic facial structure, but couldn't return him to anything approaching his former appearance. The $100,000 raised through fundraising paid for private care in facilities equipped to handle his complex medical needs. He required assistance with basic tasks: eating, bathing, navigating spaces that remained forever dark. Journalists occasionally visited Poppo in the years following the attack, seeking updates on the most famous victim of an incident that probably didn't involve bath salts at all. He remained surprisingly devoid of anger. When asked about Rudy Eugene, Poppo expressed something closer to sadness than rage. 2 lives destroyed on a highway bridge for reasons nobody fully understood. Forgiveness seemed easier than maintaining hatred. Popo died in September 2016 at age 69. The official cause was complications unrelated to the attack, though medical staff noted that the trauma had likely shortened his lifespan through accumulated physiological stress. His obituary appeared in newspapers nationwide, each one referencing May 26, 2012, as the defining moment of his existence. The decades he'd lived before and the 4 years after received minimal mention. He existed in public memory as the cannibal attack victim, nothing more. The dealers and manufacturers who'd profited from bath salts largely disappeared into comfortable obscurity. A few faced prosecution and prison time, primarily small-time distributors unlucky enough to be caught during enforcement sweeps. The major players, those who'd made millions importing synthetic cathinones from China and distributing them nationwide, generally escaped justice through sophisticated corporate structures and international complications. One manufacturer operating out of New Jersey allegedly cleared $47 million between 2010 and 2012 before the DEA shut down his operation. He'd registered legitimate-looking companies, filed appropriate paperwork, and paid taxes on research chemical sales. When federal charges came, his attorneys negotiated a plea deal resulting in 36 months in federal prison and forfeiture of assets. He served 22 months with good behavior. Upon release, he reportedly relocated to Southeast Asia and continued working in the designer drug industry, using knowledge gained from the bath salts era. Chinese chemists who'd synthesized the compounds faced almost no consequences. Their operations were legal under Chinese law at the time. When China eventually scheduled certain synthetic cathinones, the chemists simply shifted to producing different compounds or relocated to countries with even weaker regulations. The knowledge couldn't be unlearned. The synthesis equipment remained available. Only the specific products changed. Survivors of bath salts addiction struggled with recovery in ways that traditional drug treatment programs weren't equipped to handle. The psychological damage often persisted years after physical addiction ended. Former users described permanent alterations in how they experienced reality, lingering paranoia, difficulty trusting their own perceptions, occasional flashbacks to psychotic episodes that felt more real than their current circumstances. Marcus Peterson, a former accountant from Tampa who'd become addicted to bath salts in 2011, spent 3 years in various treatment programs before achieving stable sobriety. His recovery involved not just abstaining from drugs, but learning to distinguish between genuine sensory input and the phantom perceptions his damaged neural circuits occasionally generated. Shadows sometimes appeared to move wrong. Sounds occasionally carried meanings that weren't there. His brain had been rewired by synthetic cathinones in ways that might never fully heal. The families torn apart by bath salts incidents faced their own impossible recoveries. How does a mother rebuild relationship with a daughter who attacked her with a machete during psychosis? How does a child trust a father who became a monster for 18 hours? Some families managed reconciliation through extensive therapy and determined forgiveness. Others fractured permanently, the breach too profound for any amount of counselling to bridge. The parents who'd killed their children while high on bath salts existed in a hell beyond what most people could comprehend. David Newman, the Louisiana father who'd murdered his toddler daughter while convinced she was possessed, served life in prison but lived with psychological torment far exceeding any judicial punishment. He'd been a loving father transformed into a killer by chemicals purchased at a gas station. The guilt was unsurvivable. Newman attempted suicide twice during his first 3 years of incarceration. The drug landscape evolved rapidly in bath salts' wake. Alpha PVP, marketed as Flacker, emerged as the immediate successor. The chemical produced effects nearly identical to MDPV, but with a slightly different molecular structure that temporarily evaded regulations. Florida experienced a flakka epidemic between 2013 and 2015, with incidents that mirrored bath salt's worst cases: naked people running through streets, violent attacks, extreme paranoia and hallucinations. But Flakka's reign was brief. Law enforcement had learned from bath salt's mistakes and moved faster to schedule the new compound. More importantly, the market was already shifting towards substances that made synthetic cathinones look almost quaint. Fentanyl and its analogues began flooding American drug markets, offering dealers products 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin, with profit margins that synthetic cathinones couldn't match. The opioid crisis that dominated headlines from 2014 onward absorbed attention and resources that might have gone toward addressing residual synthetic cathinone problems. Fentanyl killed more people in a month than bath salts had killed during their entire peak years. The body count refocused priorities. Synthetic stimulants became yesterday's problem, while synthetic opioids created today's mass casualties. Synthetic cannabinoids, K2, Spice, and dozens of variants, filled another market segment that bath salts had briefly dominated. These chemicals, designed to mimic THC, produced their own epidemic of overdoses and hospitalizations. Emergency rooms that had developed expertise treating bath salts cases now applied similar protocols to synthetic cannabinoid patients. The drugs changed, but the presentations remained familiar: extreme agitation, unpredictable violence, psychotic breaks. The statistics revealed a disturbing paradox. Bath salts incidents decreased dramatically after 2012, dropping from thousands of emergency room visits annually to hundreds by 2015. But synthetic drug deaths overall increased every year. The decline of one specific drug category coincided with the rise of even more dangerous substances. The total harm kept escalating even as bath salts faded. Poison control centers documented the shift in real time. Call volumes about synthetic cathinones plummeted, while calls about fentanyl analogues and synthetic cannabinoids skyrocketed. The American Association of Poison Control Centers logged 6,138 synthetic cathinone calls in 2011, but only 995 in 2015. Meanwhile, synthetic opioid calls jumped from 1,267 in 2011 to 4,752 in 2015, a trajectory that would continue climbing in subsequent years. Medical examiners found novel psychoactive substances in toxicology reports with increasing frequency. The compounds often weren't identified in standard drug screens, because testing laboratories hadn't developed methods for detecting them yet. Bodies arrived with unexplained deaths, unusual presentations, confusing circumstances. Only advanced forensic analysis revealed synthetic drugs that existed in legal grey areas or hadn't been characterized at all. The dark web markets matured into sophisticated operations that dwarfed the early bath salts distribution networks. Encrypted marketplaces offered hundreds of synthetic drugs, complete with user reviews, vendor ratings, and escrow services to ensure transaction security. Law enforcement shut down major markets like Silk Road, only to watch new ones emerge within weeks. The technology had created distribution channels that were nearly impossible to eliminate through traditional enforcement. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies enabled transactions that left minimal paper trails. Vendors in China could sell directly to American users without touching the traditional financial system. No bank transfers to trace. No credit card receipts to subpoena. The money laundering problem that had plagued traditional drug trafficking became trivial with cryptocurrency. Transactions happened in minutes across international borders with near-perfect anonymity. The manufacturers who'd pioneered bath salts distribution pioneered new markets as well. They understood the regulatory cycle intimately, identify novel compounds, market aggressively during the legal window, maximize profits before bans take effect, shift to next-generation products. The business model proved remarkably resilient. Only the specific chemicals changed while the fundamental approach remained constant. Some former bath salts users discovered that sobriety meant confronting mental health issues they'd been self-medicating. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, conditions that had driven initial drug use remained even after achieving abstinence. Treatment required addressing underlying psychological problems rather than just eliminating drug consumption. Many users cycled through multiple relapses before finding stable recovery or dying from complications. The medical community incorporated bath salts into the broader narrative of synthetic drug challenges. Research papers compared synthetic cathinones to other novel psychoactive substances, identifying common patterns and treatment approaches. The accumulated knowledge from thousands of bath salts cases informed responses to subsequent epidemics. Emergency departments became more prepared for synthetic drug presentations even as the specific compounds changed. Public health officials recognized a fundamental shift in how drug epidemics developed. Traditional drugs like cocaine and heroin emerged from specific geographic regions: coca from South America, opium from Asia. Synthetic drugs could be produced anywhere with basic chemistry equipment. The democratization of drug manufacturing meant that epidemics could arise simultaneously in multiple locations without any connection to traditional trafficking routes. The regulatory framework established to combat bath salts proved inadequate for the evolving challenge. The Analog Act gave the DA authority to schedule chemically similar compounds, but the definition of similar remained subject to legal interpretation. Defense attorneys successfully argued that many novel synthetic drugs weren't analogues despite producing identical effects. The law moved slowly while chemistry moved fast. Some countries experimented with alternative approaches. New Zealand implemented a regulated legal market for novel psychoactive substances, requiring manufacturers to prove safety before products could be sold. The experiment ultimately failed. Too few products could meet safety standards while demand remained high for substances that couldn't be approved. The illegal market persisted alongside the regulated one. Portugal's decriminalisation model showed promising results for reducing drug-related harms, but didn't prevent novel psychoactive substances from circulating. Users faced treatment rather than prison, which improved health outcomes. But the underlying chemical innovation continued unabated. Decriminalisation addressed consequences without eliminating the source. The bath salts era had taught important lessons that mostly went unheeded. Legal status meant nothing for safety. Professional packaging didn't indicate legitimate products. Chemical innovation would always outpace regulation. Prohibition created more dangerous alternatives. Every lesson was documented in research papers and policy discussions, then largely ignored as the cycle repeated with new substances. By 2020, bath salts existed primarily as historical curiosity and cautionary tale. The specific compounds that had defined the crisis, MDPV, methylone, mephedrone, rarely appeared in drug seizure analyses. The products had been replaced, surpassed, made obsolete by more potent alternatives. The name bath salts persisted in popular consciousness as shorthand for dangerous synthetic drugs, even as the actual substances disappeared from circulation. The infrastructure built during the bath salts era remained operational, merely carrying different products. Chinese chemical plants, encrypted online marketplaces, cryptocurrency payment systems, international shipping channels, all the elements that had made bath salts possible, continued enabling novel drug distribution. The game continued. Only the players and products changed. And in laboratories scattered across multiple continents, chemists kept synthesizing new compounds that would eventually hit markets and create fresh epidemics. The bath salts era wasn't an aberration. It was a preview of a future where chemistry and technology combined to generate drug crises faster than governments could respond. The next disaster was already being manufactured. It just hadn't been packaged and marketed yet. The bath salts era exposed something fundamental about the intersection of capitalism and drug policy that policymakers still refuse to acknowledge. A completely legal market in dangerous chemicals flourished for years because profit motive met regulatory loopholes. Gas stations sold substances that turned people into violent psychotics because those substances generated revenue. The invisible hand of the free market distributed poison with ruthless efficiency until bodies accumulated beyond what politicians could ignore. The media's role proved equally instructive. Coverage remained minimal during thousands of actual incidents, then exploded over a single case that probably didn't involve bath salts at all. The Miami Cannibal attack generated more news stories in 1 week than the previous 2 years of legitimate bath salts violence combined. Public health crises apparently require spectacular symbolism rather than statistical reality to penetrate collective consciousness. Truth mattered less than narrative. Current statistics reveal bath salts as largely historical phenomenon. The American Association of Poison Control Centers logged only 247 synthetic cathinone calls in 2020. Down from the 2011 peak of 6,138. Emergency departments rarely treat pure bath salts cases anymore. When synthetic cathinones appear in toxicology reports, they're usually combined with other substances, fentanyl, methamphetamine, synthetic cannabinoids, part of polydrug cocktails rather than primary drugs of abuse. The specific chemicals that define the crisis essentially disappeared from circulation. MDPV seizures by law enforcement dropped to near zero by 2018. Methylone and mephedrone occasionally surface in drug analyses but represent tiny fractions of total synthetic drug detections. The compounds became expensive to synthesize relative to alternatives, difficult to obtain from manufacturers shifting to more profitable products, and carried stigma that made marketing challenging. But declaring victory against bath salts while ignoring the broader context resembles celebrating the defeat of one enemy while the entire army advances. Synthetic drug deaths increased every year since bath salts peaked. The CDC documented 11,045 deaths involving synthetic opioids in 2015, jumping to 56,016 in 2020. Fentanyl and its analogues killed more people monthly than bath salts killed during their entire existence. The problem metastasized rather than resolving. The global spread of synthetic drug manufacturing followed patterns established during bath salts era. China remained the primary source for precursor chemicals and finished products, but production capacity expanded to India, Mexico, and Southeast Asia. Nigeria developed domestic synthetic drug manufacturing capability by 2015. Brazil followed shortly after. The knowledge had dispersed beyond any government's ability to contain. Europe experienced its own synthetic cathinone epidemic slightly offset from America's timeline. Mephedrone, meow meow, dominated British club culture between 2009 and 2011 before bans pushed users toward alternatives. Eastern European countries saw alpha PVP use explode around 2014, producing incidents similar to America's worst bath salts cases. The substances circled the globe, creating localized crises that followed predictable patterns. Australia dealt with synthetic cathinones later than other regions but with equal intensity. Emergency departments in Sydney and Melbourne reported increasing presentations between 2013 and 2016. The isolated geographic location that once protected Australia from drug trafficking proved irrelevant when substances arrived through international mail systems. Dark web vendors shipped to anywhere postal services reached. Asia's synthetic drug problem evolved differently due to cultural and legal factors. Japan experienced minimal bath salts issues because extremely harsh drug laws deterred experimentation. Singapore's death penalty for drug trafficking created powerful deterrent effects. But Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia all documented growing synthetic drug markets that included cathinones among many other novel substances. The lesson repeated globally. Chemistry outpaced law enforcement. Countries watching America's bath salts crisis should have prepared for similar outbreaks. Most didn't. Policymakers assumed their different legal frameworks would prevent what happened in America. They were wrong. The substances crossed borders effortlessly, marketed through online channels that transcended geographic jurisdiction. The ongoing challenge stems from fundamental economics. Synthesizing novel psychoactive substances costs minimal amounts using widely available equipment and precursor chemicals. Distribution through encrypted online marketplaces requires no physical infrastructure beyond shipping capabilities. Cryptocurrency enables untraceable transactions. The barriers to entry for drug manufacturing and distribution have collapsed while demand remains constant. Every banned compound spawns multiple legal variants within months. The DA schedules alpha PVP and manufacturers release alpha PHP. Ban that and alpha PBP appears. The chemical variations create substances with nearly identical effects, but different enough structures to temporarily evade regulation. The game continues indefinitely because the underlying chemistry allows unlimited permutations. The broader question haunting the bath salt story remains unanswered. Why do people seek these substances knowing the risks? The reasons prove depressingly mundane. Curiosity drives initial experimentation, boredom in communities with limited opportunities, self-medication for untreated mental illness, desire to escape circumstances that feel intolerable sober. Addiction, once casual use, progresses beyond control. No single explanation captures the complexity of human drug-seeking behavior. The legal status initially attracted users who wouldn't have tried illegal drugs. That market segment largely disappeared once bath salts became scheduled substances. But new populations discovered synthetic drugs through different pathways. Homeless individuals found them cheaper than traditional drugs. Professionals unable to afford cocaine habits switched to synthetic cathinones available online. Each demographic discovered novel substances for different reasons that all reduced a fundamental demand for consciousness alteration. Treatment approaches adapted slowly to synthetic drug challenges. Protocols developed for cocaine or methamphetamine addiction proved inadequate for synthetic cathinones. The psychological damage persisted longer. The cravings hit harder. The relapse rates exceeded traditional stimulants. Treatment centers began specializing in synthetic drug addiction, recognizing that standard approaches failed with many patients. Harm reduction strategies gained traction in some jurisdictions despite political opposition. Drug testing services at festivals and clubs allowed users to identify dangerous substances before consumption. Safe consumption sites where medical staff monitored drug use prevented overdose deaths. Needle exchange programs reduced disease transmission. These interventions acknowledged that prohibition alone couldn't eliminate drug use and focused on minimizing harm. The philosophical divide between prohibition and harm reduction approaches remained unresolved. Prohibitionists argued that any accommodation normalized dangerous behavior and enabled addiction. Harm reduction advocates countered that people would use drugs regardless of legal status, making safety measures essential. Bath salts provided evidence supporting both positions. Prohibition eventually reduced availability, while harm reduction strategies helped those who used anyway. What policymakers refused to confront was the unwinnable nature of the chemical arms race. For every compound banned, chemistry offered dozens of potential replacements. The Analog Act attempted to schedule entire chemical classes rather than specific compounds, but legal definitions of similar proved contentious. courts required prosecutors to demonstrate structural similarity and pharmacological equivalence, standards that defense attorneys successfully challenged in many cases. The economic incentives driving synthetic drug development remained impossible to eliminate through enforcement alone. A chemist with $10,000 in equipment could potentially synthesize compounds worth millions on the black market. The risk-reward calculation favored continued innovation regardless of legal penalties. Only a tiny percentage of manufacturers faced prosecution, and even those who were caught often served minimal sentences compared to traditional drug traffickers. China's eventual cooperation in scheduling certain synthetic drugs proved less effective than American officials hoped. The Chinese government scheduled synthetic cathinones in 2015, followed by fentanyl analogues in 2019. But enforcement remained inconsistent. Chemical plants operated openly in industrial zones, sometimes with local government knowledge. The plants employed thousands and generated tax revenue, creating local incentives to ignore national policy. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted synthetic drug markets in unexpected ways. International mail slowed during lockdowns, reducing availability of substances ordered online. Some Chinese manufacturing facilities shut down temporarily. Users switched to locally available alternatives or traditional drugs. But the disruption proved temporary. By late 2020, synthetic drug trafficking had returned to pre-pandemic levels, using adapted distribution methods. The fentanyl crisis that dominated headlines from 2015 onward made bath salts look almost quaint by comparison. Synthetic opioids killed tens of thousands annually, while synthetic stimulants caused hundreds of deaths. The body count refocused law enforcement priorities. The DEA's synthetic drug division shifted resources toward opioids, while cathinones received diminishing attention. The market responded to enforcement patterns, producing more of what generated less scrutiny. Some veterans of the bath salts era found grim humor in watching history repeat with slight variations. The same legal loopholes, the same delayed regulatory responses, the same moral panics after media coverage of spectacular incidents, the same legislative scrambling to ban substances already being replaced by next-generation alternatives. The cycle possessed an almost mechanical inevitability. The bath salt story revealed fundamental truths about American drug policy that remain relevant as new crises emerge. Prohibition creates market opportunities for anyone willing to navigate legal grey areas. Media coverage drives political responses more effectively than medical evidence or casualty statistics. Regulatory systems designed for naturally occurring drugs prove inadequate for synthetic alternatives. Economic incentives favour continued innovation in psychoactive substance development. Perhaps most troublingly, the bath salts era demonstrated that society had lost the ability to prevent chemical epidemics before they caused mass casualties. The warning signs appeared years before the crisis peaked. Emergency room reports, poison control data, medical literature documenting novel drugs. Authorities noticed but couldn't act decisively because legal frameworks prevented intervention until after harm accumulated. The system was reactive rather than preventive. The technological acceleration of drug development means future crises will likely emerge faster and spread more widely than bath salts did. Artificial intelligence can now predict psychoactive effects of novel compounds before synthesis. 3D molecular printers may eventually allow on-demand drug manufacturing in private settings. Encrypted communications become more sophisticated yearly, making law enforcement infiltration increasingly difficult. Every technological advance favors manufacturers over regulators. Somewhere in a laboratory, maybe in China, possibly in Mexico, perhaps in a garage in suburban America, someone is currently synthesizing the next generation of designer drugs. The compounds might target neurotransmitter systems that bath salts ignored. They could produce effects more intense than anything currently available. The synthesis might be simpler, the effects more addictive, the consequences more catastrophic. The person creating these substances probably understands the harm they'll cause. Chemistry backgrounds include pharmacology. They've likely read about bath salts incidents, seen the casualties documented in medical literature, studied the regulatory responses that eventually curtailed the market. This knowledge doesn't stop them because the profit motive overwhelms ethical concerns. Someone will fill the market demand. It might as well be them collecting the money. The compounds will be packaged attractively, marketed cleverly, distributed efficiently. They'll appear in gas stations or online marketplaces or encrypted forums accessible only through specific networks. Users will try them out of curiosity or desperation or boredom. Some will enjoy the high without significant problems. Others will experience catastrophic adverse effects. A few will die in spectacular ways that eventually attract media attention. Then the cycle repeats. Politicians demand action. The DEA schedules the compounds. Manufacturers synthesize variants. New products hit the market. The regulatory response lags behind chemical innovation. Bodies accumulate. Media eventually notices. Legislation passes. The specific drug disappears, but the underlying system persists. Bath salts weren't an aberration or an anomaly that can't happen again. They were a preview of a future where chemistry and technology enabled drug crises that emerged too quickly for traditional responses to contain. The specific lesson from the bath salts era isn't about synthetic cathinones. It's about the inevitability of novel psychoactive substances appearing faster than society can respond to them. The next epidemic is already in development. The compounds are being synthesized. The distribution channels are established. The market awaits. We'll only know what they do after the emergency rooms start filling, and the casualties begin mounting, and the media finally pays attention to something that medical professionals have been documenting for months or years. And when that happens, everyone will act surprised, as if the bath salt story hadn't already shown exactly how this plays out, as if the pattern wasn't entirely predictable, as if we couldn't have seen it coming from miles away. The bath salts era ended. The age of designer drug epidemics is just beginning. The only certainty is that whatever comes next will be worse than what came before. Chemistry guarantees it. Economics demands it. Human nature ensures it. Welcome to the future. It tastes like chemicals and smells like death. And there's no going back.